She was standing on my porch with a certified letter and a smile that told me she had been looking forward to this moment for a long time. The letter said I had 30 days to remove the storage shed I had built on my own property, or the HOA would remove it for me and bill me for the privilege. She said, and I remember the exact words because I wrote them down that evening. She said, "I hope this clears things up for you, Raymond." Then she turned around and walked back to her car. I watched her go. Then I went inside, sat down at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and pulled up the county property records, the municipal zoning code, the HOA's own governing documents, and a website for a masonry supply company I had been looking at for 3 weeks. Because what Diane Kowalczyk did not know about me, what she had never bothered to find out in 4 years of treating me like an obstacle in her vision for the neighborhood, was that I had spent 28 years in commercial construction management. I knew exactly what I could build, exactly where I could build it, and exactly what she could do about it. The answer to that last question was nothing. Absolutely nothing. Stick around, because what I built over the next 6 weeks is the reason Diane no longer lives in that neighborhood, and the story of how it happened is one I have been looking forward to telling. My name is Raymond Kowalski, and I have owned my home at 4 Terrace View Lane for 11 years. The house is a modest ranch on a corner lot, 3 bedrooms, a 2-car garage, and a backyard that wraps around the south and east sides in an L shape, because of the way the lot was graded when the subdivision was developed in the 90s. I bought it from a couple in their 70s who had raised their children there and were moving to be closer to their grandchildren, and they sold it to me with the warmth of people who wanted to know it was going to someone who would take care of it. I told them I would. I have. The neighborhood was called Terrace View Estates, which was accurate in the sense that several of the lots had a partial view of the hillside to the north, and estates in the sense that someone had decided the name should sound more expensive than the housing stock warranted. It was a solid working neighborhood, the kind where people kept their lawns reasonably tidy and their cars in the driveway and waved when they drove past, and did not ask too many questions about what was happening in anyone else's yard. I liked it for exactly those qualities. After 28 years of managing construction sites, which is a job that involves being responsible for everything and having authority over almost nothing, I wanted a home that was mine and quiet and did not require me to manage anyone. The HOA that governed Terrace View Estates had been largely ceremonial for most of its existence, the kind of association that sent out a newsletter 4 times a year and organized a Labor Day picnic and otherwise left people alone. The previous president, a retired electrician named Howard Buss, had run it that way for 9 years, and the neighborhood had functioned well under his approach, which was to enforce the rules that mattered and ignore the ones that did not, and to use common sense in the substantial middle ground between those 2 categories. Howard moved away 2 years before this story begins. The election that followed his departure produced Diane Kowalczyk. Diane had moved into the neighborhood 3 years prior with her husband and 2 large dogs, and a set of opinions about residential aesthetics that she had apparently been developing for some time and was now prepared to implement. She was in her mid-50s, had a background in interior design consulting, and brought to the HOA presidency the specific conviction of a person who had spent their career advising other people about how things should look, and who had finally obtained actual authority to enforce it. Within her first year, she had revised the architectural guidelines to require pre-approval for any exterior modification, introduced a landscape maintenance scorecard that was evaluated quarterly by a committee she appointed, and created a fine structure for violations that was significantly more aggressive than anything Howard had ever used. My first interaction with Diane in her official capacity was a notice I received 14 months into her presidency citing the condition of my rear fence. The fence was a wooden privacy fence, 6 years old, that had weathered unevenly on the north-facing sections and had some boards that needed replacing or repainting. It was not attractive in those sections. I will give her that. It also was not in violation of any provision that had existed when the fence was installed. Diane had added a wood fence maintenance standard to the guidelines in her first year, requiring that all wooden fencing be maintained in uniform color and condition, and she was applying it retroactively to fences that predated the standard. I repaired the fence because the repair was reasonable regardless of the notice, and I noted in my written response that the standard she was citing had been enacted after my fence was installed, which was a procedural issue I was flagging for the record. Diane's written response acknowledged my repair and said the matter was closed. She did not address the procedural issue. My second interaction with her came 8 months later. She sent a notice about a portable basketball hoop my son Daniel had set up in the driveway during a summer visit. Daniel was 22 and came home for 2 weeks in July every year, and the basketball hoop was a tradition going back to when he was 12. The notice cited a provision prohibiting portable recreational equipment from being stored in driveways or on front lawns for more than 48 consecutive hours. Daniel took the hoop down. He was gracious about it. I was less gracious internally, but I wrote a polite response acknowledging the notice, and that was that. The shed was my third interaction with Diane, and it was the one that changed the nature of our relationship permanently. I had built the shed the previous autumn, a 12 by 16-foot structure in the rear corner of my L-shaped lot, set back from both property lines by the setback distances specified in the municipal code. It was a well-built structure. I had designed it myself and framed it over 2 weekends with help from my friend Curtis, who had worked carpentry for 30 years and whose involvement guaranteed that the framing was square and the roof was right. I sided it to match my house, painted it the same color, installed proper ventilation, and put a concrete pad under it. It looked like a small building that belonged on the property, which was what it was. I used it to store my lawn equipment and my tools, and the construction reference materials I had accumulated over 28 years that I could not bring myself to part with. I had not submitted a pre-approval application to the HOA before building the shed. I am going to be honest about this because it matters to the account. I knew the pre-approval requirement existed. I made a judgment that the shed, being in the rear corner of my lot, set back appropriately from the property lines, and matching the house in appearance would not be an issue. I had seen other residents build similar structures without going through the process, and I had thought the process was mainly directed at visible modifications to the front of properties. This judgment was wrong, not because the shed was actually a problem, but because I had underestimated Diane's commitment to process as an end in itself. The certified letter she delivered arrived 11 months after the shed was built. It cited the pre-approval requirement, noted that I had not obtained pre-approval, and demanded removal within 30 days. The letter was correct that I had not obtained pre-approval. It was not correct, as I discovered when I read the architectural guidelines carefully for the first time, that the shed was otherwise in violation of any standard. It met the size requirements for accessory structures. It met the setback requirements. It matched the house. If I had submitted the pre-approval application, it would have been approved because there was no basis to deny it. I called the HOA's process line and asked whether I could submit a retroactive pre-approval application, given that the structure was code compliant in every respect except the process. The board member I spoke with said he would check with Diane and get back to me. Diane's response, relayed by the board member the following day, was that retroactive approvals were not available under the current guidelines and that the removal requirement stood. I asked whether the board had the discretion to make an exception for a structure that met all substantive standards. The board member said that in his understanding Diane's position was that the process requirement was not discretionary. I went to an HOA meeting and made my case in person. I brought photographs of the shed, a copy of the municipal building permit I had obtained for it, and a written summary of the setback and size compliance. I pointed out that the shed was indistinguishable in appearance from a permitted accessory structure, that it had a valid city building permit, and that denying retroactive approval for a compliant structure on purely procedural grounds served no legitimate community purpose. I was polite and factual, and I thought I made a reasonable case. Diane listened to my presentation with the expression of a person who had already decided and was waiting for me to finish. When I was done, she said that the guidelines existed for a reason and that allowing retroactive approvals would undermine the entire pre-approval system. The board voted with her 4-1. The one was a man named Pete Garza who looked uncomfortable about it, but whose discomfort did not produce a different vote. I drove home and sat at my kitchen table and thought about 28 years of commercial construction and what I knew about property rights and building codes and the specific limits of an HOA's authority. The following morning, I called my attorney, a man named Dennis Park, who had handled a property matter for me 8 years prior and who had a particular interest in HOA governance law. I explained the situation. Dennis listened and asked several precise questions, and then said that the removal order had some procedural validity, since I had in fact not obtained pre-approval, but that the HOA's refusal to consider retroactive approval for a fully compliant structure was worth examining, because HOA governing bodies have a fiduciary obligation to their members that includes acting reasonably and not imposing burdens that serve no legitimate purpose. He said he would review the governing documents and the municipal code and get back to me within a week. He called back in 4 days. He said the situation was more interesting than he had initially thought. He had found 2 things. First, the pre-approval requirement itself had been enacted by Diane without the full community vote required by the HOA Charter for amendments that created new compliance obligations on members. It had been passed by a board resolution rather than a member vote, which the charter language did not support for this category of amendment. Second, the removal order for the shed required me to demolish a structure that had a valid municipal building permit. Ordering a property owner to demolish a permitted structure is a more serious legal step than Diane appeared to understand, because it potentially conflicts with the city's permitting authority and creates liability questions that an HOA board is generally not equipped to navigate. Dennis said that taken together, these 2 elements gave us a credible basis to challenge the removal order and potentially the entire pre-approval regime she had instituted. I asked Dennis to write a formal response to the removal order documenting these issues and requesting that the board reconsider. He wrote it. It was thorough and precise, and it laid out the procedural invalidity of the pre-approval requirement and the legal complications of the demolition order clearly and without hostility. It gave the board a clean path to withdraw the order and address the governance issue, which Dennis said was the right thing to offer before moving to harder options. Diane's response was to send the certified letter. She came to my door personally to deliver it, which was when she said the thing about hopping this cleared things up for me, and which was when I said the 3 words I said, and which was when I went inside and opened my laptop and pulled up the county property records. What I was looking at in the county property records was the full survey of my lot, which I had obtained when I bought the house, and which I had not looked at with full attention since then. I was looking at it now with the specific attention of a man who had spent 28 years reading property surveys and site plans professionally, and I was looking at the dimensions and angles and easements and setbacks with a question in mind. The question was, given the exact dimensions of my lot, the exact location of my house and the existing shed, and the exact setback requirements of the municipal code, what is the maximum structure I could legally build on this property without any HOA approval whatsoever? The answer, which took me about 90 minutes to calculate with full precision, was more than I had expected. The municipal code in my city had an exemption from the HOA pre-approval requirement for what it classified as retaining walls and below-grade structures, because these were considered engineering and drainage matters under the city's jurisdiction rather than aesthetic matters under the HOA's. It also had a provision that any structure built against an existing structure, meaning sharing a wall or foundation, was considered an extension of that structure rather than a new accessory structure, and was subject to the building permit process, but not to HOA pre-approval for existing homes in established neighborhoods. And it had a provision that masonry walls built along property lines for the purpose of grade separation or privacy on corner lots, because corner lots presented specific site challenges, were allowed up to 8 feet in height with a valid building permit and did not require HOA pre-approval. I read that provision 3 times. My lot was a corner lot. The L-shaped rear yard wrapped around the south and east sides. The eastern boundary ran along the secondary street, and along that boundary there was a grade change, a roughly 18-inch difference in elevation between my lot and the street, which was the kind of grade separation that a masonry retaining wall was specifically designed to address. I called Dennis the following morning and read him the provision. He was quiet for a moment, and then he asked me to read it again. I read it again. He said, "Raymond, are you thinking what I think you are thinking?" I told him I was a construction manager and that I knew how to read a code provision. He said let him review it that evening and he would call me the next morning. He called the next morning and said the provision was as clear as I had read it and that a masonry privacy wall along my eastern property line on the corner lot, built to address the grade separation, would fall within the exemption and would not require HOA pre-approval. He said I would need a building permit from the city and a licensed contractor and a proper engineering plan, but that the HOA had no authority over it. He also said, and I want to be accurate about his exact words, he said, "Raymond, you did not hear this from me. But if a person were building a wall along their eastern property line to address a grade separation, and that wall happened to be 8 feet tall and happened to run the full length of the boundary, and happened to be constructed of materials that would last indefinitely, and happened to produce a visual result that would be visible from multiple HOA properties for the foreseeable future, that would be entirely within that person's legal rights." He paused. Then he said, "I will have the permit application reviewed and ready by Thursday." I called Curtis that afternoon. Curtis, who had helped me frame the shed and who had been following the situation with the engaged interest of a friend who enjoys watching someone get what is coming to them, listened to my description of the wall I wanted to build and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Raymond, I have been waiting for you to make a move like this since Diane took that basketball hoop from your son. When do we start?" I told him the permit would be ready Thursday. He said he would have the material list ready Wednesday. The permit came through in 8 days, which was faster than I had expected, and which Dennis said reflected the clarity of the application and the legitimacy of the project. I had submitted full engineering drawings, which I prepared myself because 28 years of construction management means that engineering drawings are not a foreign language to me, and the permit examiner had found nothing to flag. The building permit for a masonry privacy and grade retention wall, 8 feet in height, along the eastern property line of 4 Terrace View Lane, was issued on a Tuesday morning. I called the masonry supply company that same afternoon. The materials arrived Friday: concrete masonry units, mortar, reinforcement bar, gravel for the footing drainage, and the bags of ready mix for the footings themselves. Curtis arrived Saturday morning at 7 with his truck and his tools and a coffee he had brought for me, and we laid out the project together the way we had laid out the shed framing 2 years before, measuring twice and marking carefully and confirming every dimension before touching anything. The lot geometry was exact in my drawings, and the lot geometry in reality was exact to my drawings, which is the result of 28 years of checking and double-checking. The footings went in that Saturday, a full day of excavation and forming and pouring that left us both tired, and the concrete setting overnight. Sunday we stripped the forms and examined the footings, and they were right. Curtis said they were better than right. I said they were what the drawings specified. He said that was what he meant. The block work started Monday. Curtis and I worked together on the first 4 courses, establishing the plumb and level that everything above would depend on. And then I brought in a masonry crew Curtis knew for the remaining courses, because the project needed to move faster than 2 people working weekends could manage, and because I wanted it done while Diane was still in the neighborhood to see it go up. The crew was efficient and skilled, and they treated the work with the care that the work deserved. I was on site every morning before they arrived and every evening after they left, checking the courses, examining the joint work, confirming the reinforcement placement at each bond interval. The wall went up at the rate of 2 courses per day, and each evening when I drove home I could see it from the street, growing along my eastern boundary, straight and plumb, and getting taller. On the fourth day of block work, Diane drove past. I know because I was standing at the corner of my lot checking the alignment when her car came down the cross street, and I watched it slow, and I watched it stop, and I watched Diane in the driver's seat looking at 8 feet of concrete masonry going up along my property line. The car sat there for probably 45 seconds, then it drove on. I went back to checking the alignment. By the end of the second week, the wall was at full height, the bond beam was poured, and the finish coat was going on. I had specified a smooth grey finish, not decorative, not elaborate, just clean and permanent, and the same on both sides. From my yard, it was a clean background surface that actually set off the plantings along the base quite well. From the street, from Diane's property, from anywhere east of my lot, it was 8 feet of solid grey concrete block running the full length of my eastern boundary, 104 linear feet of it, mortared and reinforced, and built to last longer than anyone currently living in the neighborhood. Diane called the HOA's process line the morning after the finish coat dried. I know this because Pete Garza, who had cast the one uncomfortable vote against me and who had been watching the wall go up with what I read as a complicated expression, texted me that afternoon to tell me. He said Diane had demanded an emergency board meeting to address what she was calling an unauthorized structure. I texted back that the wall had a valid building permit, was built within the code-specified exemption from HOA pre-approval, and that Dennis Park would be happy to discuss the legal situation with the board's counsel if that would be helpful. Pete texted back a thumbs up. I took that as an indication of the direction things were going. The board meeting was held 4 days later. Dennis attended with me. Diane had prepared what she called a legal brief, which was a document she had written herself citing several HOA provisions she believed applied to the wall. Dennis reviewed it before the meeting and told me it was not going to survive contact with the actual code. He was right. The exemption language was clear, and the permit was valid, and the board's own counsel, when he reviewed Dennis's documentation during a recess, came back and told the board in terms I would describe as gentle but unambiguous that there was no legal basis to order the wall removed or to fine me for building it. Diane argued for an hour. She cited the neighborhood's character and the aesthetic impact and the precedent it set. Dennis sat quietly through most of this, and then, when it was clear the board was looking for a way to close the meeting, he pointed out that the board's pre-approval requirement, which was the original basis for the removal order that had started this sequence of events, had been enacted without the member vote required by the charter and was therefore procedurally invalid, and that the removal order for the shed was therefore also without valid authority, and that if the board wished to avoid a formal legal challenge to those actions, it should consider withdrawing the removal order and addressing the charter compliance issue. He said this without any particular drama, in the tone of a man presenting information that the other party was free to use or not use. The board voted to withdraw the removal order for the shed. They also voted to form a committee to review the procedures by which the pre-approval requirement had been enacted. Pete Garza was appointed to chair that committee, which I thought was the right choice. Diane voted against both motions. She was the only one. The drive home that evening was one of the more pleasant I can remember. The wall was visible from 3 blocks away as I turned onto my street, standing in the evening light, solid and grey and permanent. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment and looked at it. Then I went inside and called Curtis and told him the meeting had gone as expected. He said he was glad to hear it and asked if I wanted to come over for dinner. I told him I had some steaks I had been saving for exactly this occasion and that he should come to me. Curtis came over and I grilled the steaks, and we sat on my back patio with the wall on our east and the neighborhood on our west, and the evening settling over everything quietly. And Curtis said that it was the best wall he had ever helped build, and I told him it was the best I had ever designed, and we ate our steaks in the particular satisfaction of men who have done a thing completely and correctly and are sitting in the results of it. Diane resigned from the HOA presidency 6 weeks later. The Charter Compliance Review had found 4 additional provisions besides the pre-approval requirement that had been enacted without proper member votes. The board, now under Pete's leadership, spent 2 months holding the properly noticed community votes to address them. Most of the provisions were approved by the membership with modifications that made them more reasonable. The pre-approval requirement was approved in a modified form that included a reasonable timeline, a clear list of what required approval and what did not, and an explicit provision for retroactive approval of compliant structures. The shed remains where it has always been. It has never been a problem to anyone. Diane put her house on the market in the spring following her resignation. I did not watch her move out. I was in my backyard on the day her moving truck came, tending the perennial bed I had planted along the base of the wall, which was doing well in the shelter the wall provided from the east wind. I heard the truck come and go over the course of a few hours, and I kept working in my garden, and I thought about the question Diane had apparently never asked herself, which was, what kind of person am I dealing with, and what do they actually know how to do? If she had asked that question about me, the answer was available. 28 years in commercial construction management, a corner lot with a grade separation, a code provision she had not read, a wall she could not stop. The wall is 3 years old. The perennial bed at its base is established and blooming. The neighborhood is quieter now in the specific way that places get quiet when the thing generating the noise is gone. Pete runs the HOA with the same reasonable approach Howard Buss had used before him, which is to enforce what matters and leave people alone about what does not. I have not received a notice since the shed matter was resolved. The wall catches the morning light on the east face, and in certain seasons it is actually quite attractive from the street, the gray concrete with the plantings at its base and the sky above it. Several neighbors have mentioned this. I appreciate the observation. I built it to last, and I built it to be right, and something built right tends to find its own kind of dignity over time. I am a construction manager. I know what can be built and where and how and to what standard. The next person who hands me a certified letter and says they hope this clears things up for me is going to find out that the answer to their question is always yes. It does clear things up, every time.